DevOps Iterations.
So here we are, the first episode of Abnormal DevOps Iterations, which is supposed to be a podcast, let's say, about Puppet, DevOps, IT, AI, whatever is related to computers. And I'm very happy to have here in the first episode Luke Kanies, who is nothing less than the founder of Puppet and who created the tool I've been using and working with for more than 18 years, I guess, or something like that.
So we're pushing 20 now. We're not quite there, but it's getting there.
Yeah, we are getting there. So, Luke, first of all, how are you and what are you doing in these days?
I'm complicated. I seem to be one of the lucky ones who's gotten long COVID. So I was running a startup in 2020 and I got very sick. And in retrospect, the symptoms I had all align perfectly with the symptoms of long COVID. So I've spent most of the last 4 years essentially convalescing and trying to get back to health. I was running a startup in 2020 and had to shut the company down a year later because I couldn't run it anymore. And since then, I've gotten lucky and Puppet, the company, has sold, and so I don't have to work, which is very good because I would probably not be able to right now. So I am spending my time essentially with family and trying to get healthy, and also doing a small amount of like advisory investment work, but not a lot, and kind of trying to, with the energy I have, trying to figure out how to spend some of that in technology areas that are interesting and compelling, but they're quite different and quite small relative to Puppet.
All right. Okay. I hope you have signs of recovery over the times. No, I mean,
much better than I was 4 years ago. I'm definitely not all the way there yet.
Okay. So first time I hear that. Well, best of luck for the
Thank
future.
You.
So I would say now let's go to some more maybe technical stuff, which maybe is more funny. Or first of all, Puppet. You did this. You basically had this idea of creating a tool to manage systems way long ago.
Mm-hmm.
I guess this is an old question, but maybe sometime you are not asked this question. How everything started, and why did you start Puppet itself?
Yeah, it was a combination of things. I certainly wasn't the first person to come up with the idea. There were, at the time, I was part of the Lisa community, which is a Usenix sysadmin conference, or was. I don't know that it still exists. And they had a config management like workshop, and there were multiple tools, CF Engine being by far the largest one. And I was a CF Engine user at the time. And essentially, the thing that I thought was missing from the existing tools was a commitment to building something that everyone could use. So a lot of the people who were building these tools, like LCFG is a great example of a tool that was barely used, but it was its author was primarily interested in it as essentially a scientific endeavor. He was a professor at University of Edinburgh and was very interested in the research side, but was not terribly concerned with whether it could be used by the average person to make their world better. CF Engine was far more widely used than anything else, but it's still, and Mark Burgess is a fantastic guy, and I've got a ton of respect for him. But he was still primarily interested in the scientific computer science aspects of what he could get out of CF Engine, and was less interested in, I want to build a product that is going to be usable by absolutely everybody. So when I was building Puppet, my main thing was like, how do I build something that kind of solves the same problem these other products solve, but solves it in a way that instead of 2 universities can use it, or a couple hundred or a couple thousand people on the internet, but instead like hundreds of thousands of people? How can I build something that every company in the world that has more than 10 computers should realistically use this software? Now, obviously, we didn't quite get to the point where it's running on every computer in the world, but obviously we got orders of magnitude more than anything else had before us.
Cool. And actually, well, it did a long journey, Puppet, over the years. According to you, what has been, in retrospective, the best technical decisions you made over the years around Puppet?
I mean, with a product like Puppet, it's hard to separate the technical achievements versus any other kind of achievement. But, the fact that we ran on everything is pretty great, right? Like, there was that period of time. I don't know what the world looks like now because I'm not really part of this world. But like when I started Puppet, the number of operating systems you would realistically encounter in the average organization was quite large. Like today, it's pretty much like, you probably have one or maybe three varieties of Linux and Windows and Mac. And back then you could have 10 different Unixes, and the Unix would be so completely unrelated to each other, right? You'd have OpenBSD for your routers or your firewalls, and you'd have, AIX, and you'd have, I when I was doing consulting before Puppet, did a small amount of work on Data General Unix. You would run into HPUX. I was automating, like Puppet supported not initially. When I no longer maintained it, it supported, like I personally wrote support for like 25 separate packaging systems in Puppet. And I think the last time I checked, it was closer to 40. So the fact that we had a design that, I'm not going to say it was perfect, but actually did scale relatively well from I've got one operating system and I just need to care about that one operating system to I've actually got like 10 operating systems and I need to care about all of these. And the concerns that the group that owns AIX has are completely different from the group that owns Solaris, are completely different from the group that owns macOS, are completely different from the group that owns RHEL. Like the fact that one tool can do all that, at least, with some success, I think is pretty great.
Yeah, indeed. The abstraction of Puppet of the resources is really, I think, one of the key values. And on the same, let's say, path, the worst technical choice, if you any.
I don't think there's a lot of value in like going back and saying I should have done something differently. In retrospect, my life would have been a lot easier if I could have used Python to write Puppet instead of Ruby, because Python is by far the more commonly used language in the spaces where you use it, right? If you look at any other tool, almost no other system tools use Ruby. I tried it in Python and Python just doesn't work for me. It makes my eyes bleed. So that's not, it was a choice, but it's hard to believe I could have made a different choice. A lot of things are just things there are some internal implementation things that I wish I had done differently. I've still got 2 pull requests that I wrote in, I'm going to say 2010, 2011 that I'm not quite willing to delete, but I'm confident they would never merge anymore, that restructure and rename really, really key internal classes. And that crucially, I think when I wrote them, I was teaching myself to be a developer at the time, right? So I was as a sysadmin when I started Puppet. I'd written maybe 5,000 lines of code in my life before that. So it's not something where I knew what I was doing. I was learning what I was doing as I was going. And so these 2 classes, which was the class for actually doing work on a system, what I called the transaction class, and then the core Puppet resource type class, the one that you say, okay, well, this is what it means to be a type, and then this is what it means to be specifically a package type. Those 2 classes I structured, in my opinion, like poorly, and I could have done them much, much better. But those were the kind of thing that like no one else notices, right? Like I would call that my worst technical mistake, but also, probably 10 people in the world have ever encountered those things, other than you might look through the code and go, well, I don't understand what's happening here. I'm not going to touch it, right? Which, there were lots of developers I paid who did exactly that. They were like, well, I'm willing to touch anything except not those 2 things. So
Right. I would say also some naming conventions inside Puppet.
Whoa. I didn't know we were going to talk about naming. Yeah, naming is super hard, right? Like this is, for one, just the whole idea of like, what's the difference between a type and a resource? And Puppet existed for probably 3 years, certainly at least 2 years before I came up with the term resource. And I'm sure it was a community effort. It wasn't something where I came up with it, but I think I was calling it an object before that. And it's like, you could be worse off from a naming perspective. So some things got better over time.
Yeah, indeed. So I guess time have changed in the IT landscape a lot since you made Puppet. If you would find yourself now creating a tool which is supposed to solve the same problems of which Puppet was solving, but in today's world, what kind of tool would you do? Or maybe you will say there is already some tools doing that. But how do you?
Yeah, the short version is I don't have anywhere near enough idea what the world looks like to answer that question. I'm going to try to answer it anyway, but it's based on outdated information. Because when I left Puppet, I was fired in 2016, and there's a whole complicated story behind that. But I had spent at that point like 17, 18 years in the world of operations, 20, I guess. And I was definitely done. I was ready for something else. And so since leaving Puppet, I haven't paid close attention to this space, right? I feel like I have done enough and I get to do other stuff now. So I'm not up to date, and I'm not going to try to say I'm up to date. So forgive me if everything I say sounds stupid, but the couple of things that I wish were different about Puppet in terms of its legacy are the closest thing to an answer that I can give you for that. And I would say the first thing is I wish the Puppet language was more standalone as an individual tool. Like if I want to use Puppet, like I actually have I have a small amount of Puppet code managing my home directory, and just like creates some symlinks and stuff like that. There still isn't a great way to do that without Puppet or something like Puppet. It's not like, it would be more fun if, in my opinion, if essentially the like Puppet language and some much smaller pieces of it were more standalone, and then the pipeline that connected the output of that language was itself a separate tool, right? So just instead of Puppet being this one big thing, make it a bunch of smaller things. And especially to make the like scripting engine aspect of Puppet to be something that could be used really small and independently. If you look at like Git, for example, yes, of course, most people who use Git, they use it connected to a backend server and they have friends use it and stuff like that. You don't have to use it that way. Git is a very small tool that by itself, you can just have a version controlled repository of text on your local machine and never do anything with it. And never copy it anywhere or anything like that. I wish Puppet was more like that. And I think that if it were more like that, it'd be easier to connect it to other deeper pipelines and other tools. So yes, I'm using this more sophisticated, complicated system to build and manage all my stuff. But also one part of that chain is this much, much smaller system. Instead of, a lot of how we thought about the world was, let's be all inclusive. Let's encompass everything. Well, there are ways in which that works, but as it begins to fail, it fails, painfully. And an example of that is I really wish that earlier on, that we had taken pieces that were successful in Puppet and had treated them more like independent products. I wish that Factor had been more of an independent product. It was always treated as a subsidiary. And you look at like when Chef decided to build their own project, and they didn't like how I was running Puppet, and so they said, screw this guy, we're going to make our own thing. They also re-implemented Factor. And instead of saying, hey, one part of this tool already works fine, let's build on that. And if you look, almost no one has ever built on Factor. And to me, that's a failure of Factor as an open source project, right? I wish that, and I think even today, there isn't a product on my computer. Like if I look at the Linux box under my desk, or I look at my Mac, there's no project that's just like, well, of course this is on your computer, and of course it's widely distributed, and of course everyone builds on it. So to me, that's a failure of our, but largely my imagination to say this thing deserves its own space, and this thing deserves leadership that's not just mine, and we could have this be better, and we can have this be more broadly used. And probably the other big failure in that same area is there was like a 10-year period where we had the best certificate manager in the world. And by that, I mostly mean we had the only certificate manager in the world. Because I know when I started Puppet, I knew certs were going to be really important because it's the only natural way for computers to authenticate with computers. And I looked at what else was out there. And in 2005, when I started, if you asked, how do I generate a certificate? How do I do that for authentication? 100%, everybody said, go to ca.pl. It's this like random Perl script that you had to download and run. And that was the only way to do it. So I did the work of like implementing a certificate manager from scratch, and it did all of it, right? That was good enough, and it was valuable enough that we should have pulled that out and said, let's not make this Puppet CA. Let's make this a completely separate product. Let's make it small. Let's make it fast. And we didn't do that because we were pretty focused on, building a business and solving very focused customer needs. But it also means that, like, where's my certificate manager on my local machine? Where, how hard is it for me? I've got a local network. I was just before this call, I was logging into my local router, and it complained about having a certificate that it doesn't trust. It's like, well, my choices are basically I can go to Let's Encrypt, or I can keep using this unsigned cert. Well, like, shouldn't there be another area where, like, I can say, look, my home has a CA, and I trust my home CA, and I'm going to send certificates from my CA to everybody else. It's like, well, you could do that, but it would be a pain, right? Like, but why would it be a pain? It shouldn't need to be a pain. That tool chain should exist. It should be pervasive. It should be free. And everybody else that needs CAs, need certificates, should build on that tool chain. So those are things that I would definitely do differently, is take these things and make them smaller, make them more self-contained, make their connections to each other more built on APIs. And the connections in Puppet are all built very much on, frankly, pretty clean APIs. But the separation between the products isn't what I would do in the future.
Interesting indeed. About future, according to you, what is the future of Puppet?
Well, I always said that if Puppet succeeds, then in 2040, there's going to be somebody who is incredibly pissed off at me because Puppet is running on some machines in their basement. They don't know which ones. They keep changing things, and Puppet silently corrects, undoes the changes they make. They don't know how to stop it. So, one way of saying it is the future of Puppet is to continue harassing sysadmins for decades to come, whether they want it or not. And you could argue that's a cynical way of looking at it, but to me, like, to be in a kind of cockroach form of technology that is so useful, you just can't get rid of it. I think has some humor to it, and certainly I have been the victim of some of those technologies that never go away. So, beyond that, honestly, I don't know. I don't know enough about what's going on in the world today, and anything I would, any opinion I have is 10 years old. So yeah, it's hard to answer that.
Well, we can have opinions. I mean, even if they are based on old facts.
I just don't like doing that. It's not my style.
So all my questions about the future.
Sorry, I don't have a ton. I don't know. It's let me just say, I cannot recommend. I was on the board of Puppet, but not the CEO for 6 years, and those 6 years really, really sucked. Because the board made it very clear that they were uninterested in my opinions, and the people on the ground doing their work would have been happy to talk to me, but the leadership, the executives who managed all those teams, made it very clear they wanted nothing to do with me. And so, in general, I was very cut off from any of the deliberations about the future. And so, even if I'd have stepped down from CEO and been interested in that kind of stuff, I would have had a hard time staying connected. But given I was not otherwise connected to the industry and the community because I wasn't doing sysadmin related stuff, that plus the disconnection internally at Puppet meant that it was very hard for me to have a good sense of what was going on in the market. And I recognized my limitations there.
So on these lines, if I can ask, what was the worst business good decisions you did over the years?
I mean, objectively, it's easy to say I shouldn't have pissed Adam Jacob off. He decided to found Chef because I wouldn't support one of his customers for free. There was a bug in Puppet, and the only companies who could reliably reproduce that bug were his paying customers. And at the time, I was... I can't remember if this was before or after my twins were born, but it was very much a low point in the very early days of Puppet. I was completely burnt out. I was completely strung out. I was working every waking hour, and it had gotten big enough that I'm gonna sneeze in a second. So it had gotten big enough that it was clearly working, but it was asking so much of me I couldn't say yes to everything. I couldn't I was barely doing any program at that point. I was supporting users, I was supporting customers, I was writing documentation, I was doing training classes, I was going on site and helping people implement things because this had been my full-time job. I quit a full-time job and spent 10 months without any income working on Puppet, and then, had some kind of income, but at that point it was just me. We had a bug, and he was basically like, you have to fix this. And I was like, but they're not my customers. Like, they're paying you for support, and I think, they're not my customers. I can't resolve this. I've tried to discover the bug. I've tried to find it. I can't find it, and I can't fix it, and they're not the ones paying me. So I don't understand. And I'm sure I was not super happy, because again, I was like, I'm struggling to eat. You guys are making more from Puppet than I am right now. You're not offering me money. You're not, you're making money and I'm not. And somehow it's my job to help you and your customers. So I'm sure I was somewhat salty about it. So he got pissed off and said, oh, well, and then he, proceeded to badmouth me for years, saying, oh, we didn't like the way Puppet supported their customers. It's like, well, they weren't my customers, but clearly in retrospect, if I could have found some way to not piss off Adam Jacob, and so he wouldn't take his toys and go home and start his own company, it was way harder. The fact that there were two of us competing all the time made it stupid and hard. And if it had not been a Puppet Chef situation and there had just been one for the next 5 years, it would have been way easier to do a lot of stuff. So, that's definitely the largest business mistake I made.
Still, I would say now, if we have to name a major Puppet competitor, is not Chef anymore.
Yeah, 100%. No, yeah, but from 2009 to 2015, it was brutal. I mean, every time I was trying to raise money, it always came up. Every customer, there were aspects of the marketing conversations that Chef was way better at. We were always bigger. We were always better. We were always more widely used. We always had more revenue. We were always a more successful company. But every single conversation was more expensive and more complicated. And every company you'd go into, there's at least one person who is a diehard on one of the two tools. And so you're going in and it's like, look, it almost doesn't matter which one you pick, just pick one. And it's like, well, no, there's that guy in the corner who hates that one and requires you pick the other one. And so suddenly, instead of an hour or two discussion and some technical proof, now it's like weeks of political argument just to get by that one person. And it's like, no one's life is better off because we had to spend 3 weeks arguing about this in some, with some bank in Idaho or whatever. So, yeah.
Okay. Well, anyway, but
we won, but that doesn't make it a good business decision.
Let's say you have the possibility to be now back to in charge of Puppet, and you can decide the future of Puppet now. What you would do, technically, and maybe also in terms of strategically, how you would position the tool, what you would try to do.
Yeah, I think. I mean, my natural thing would be to try to do the things that I was already trying to do, some of which people tried to do after I left also. So everything that I would answer to this falls under the, you start with strategy and then you go from there to the technology. The big thing that I was trying to do when I got fired from Puppet, and then that still clearly has not been done, is I wanted to train the market to care about how automated their systems were. I wanted the entire industry, there was a point where, 2005 to 2015-ish, where if you met somebody working in standard corporate IT infrastructure, one of the first phrases out of their mouth was what percent virtualized they were. And that was VMware had trained the entire industry that percent virtualization was a key metric, even though in practice it doesn't matter in the slightest, right? It doesn't actually help most organizations very much. And I certainly met plenty of companies who were 90% virtualized, but it took them just as long to deliver a virtual server as it used to take them to deliver a physical server. It's like, well, what was the point of virtualization if it still takes you 6 weeks to give me a Linux box? But it was one of those things where, and honestly, I'm not sure I can come up with any other examples where the entire industry said, hey, adoption of this new technology and pervasive adoption is actually really important. And I'm going to be measured on it from the frontline employee all the way up to the CIO or CTO. And I think that there's a similar story to be told about percent automated, where you can say, how much of your infrastructure could you rebuild from scratch if it all went away? Not Mark Burgess. I can't remember his name. Somebody in the Evangelization community used to talk about, like, if we threw your main server out the window, what would be how long would it take you to rebuild it? This is back in 2001, and the answer was always like, we would never rebuild it because our company would be shut down. Like, if that machine went away, we would be dead. These days, people are much better than that. It's not that bad usually, not never, but usually. But there still is way more manual work than you would think, and especially there's way less visibility into the system of work than you would think. And what I would like to do is build a marketing and product strategy around how do you as an organization understand the entire, like, how change gets deployed throughout your network, and how do you understand what percent of that change is done automatically, is done with tooling, versus what percent of that change requires a human to show up somewhere and press buttons or type things or things like that. And especially as, if you're on the ground, I want to give you that visibility so you can point it and say, like, oh, wow, over here things happen manually and therefore they happen slowly, but over here they happen automatically and therefore they happen fast. How do I make my other systems more like that? But then as a leader, I want you to be able to say, like, these teams are really, really good at pushing change out. And I can see that 100% of their systems are, connected to the automation system. I can see that 100% of the changes that go out are, automated changes. But then these other teams actually haven't updated. They refuse to adopt the new tech. They refuse to adopt not just the new tech, but the new process. How do we, so now as a leader, I know, like, oh, I'm 35% automated, but when I talk to my peers, they're 98% automated. And weirdly, my peers are all driving, Porsches, and I'm driving a Honda. What happened there? So it starts with that marketing and a product story, and then from there you begin to say, like, well, what needs to happen for that to be the case? And the Puppet Discovery, which is what I was building when I left Puppet, the idea there was, like, today, how much, if you go into an average large organization that has somewhere between, let's say, 5,000 and 100,000 servers, is there anybody in the world today, even now, who has visibility into what machines do we have? How often, like, what are they doing? Why are they there? Who owns them? That visibility is still mostly missing, and it's quite hard to do at an organizational level, but it's not technically challenging, right? It's not like having a database with 200,000 rows in it is hard, right? Like, that's not hard. Talking to 200,000 servers is not hard, right? Ask Ari Pinar. He's got a system running in his labs that can easily talk to 100,000 systems, every couple minutes without being bogged down at all. What's hard is the political side, and especially hard aligning the technology and the political. And so what I would want to do is, let's take the technical capabilities of Puppet. Let's take our ability to understand the systems and to connect the systems, and connect that with higher level views. And also, like, one of the things that we always said in Puppet was, like, oh, well, you should be 100% automated, but there's work to do way upstream of that. Can we see your computer at all, right? Is it on the network at all? Do we have workflows built so that when a new machine shows up, we know, who's got it, who's responsible for it, what things are running? Like, there's some really basic stuff that you can do long before you do any automation. And when you do those basic things, it gives you the kind of foothold to then begin to say, okay, well, we're on board now. Why don't we keep DNS updated? We're on board now. Let's do some really basic things. And then the perspective of how automated are we begins to move from the server perspective, which is, Puppet's very server oriented in how it was built. But you want to move from that to service oriented, not how many machines are automated, but what percent of, like, DNS configurations are automated around the world, right? And I always start with DNS and time servers, because they're these little things that if they go wrong, then they go wrong in weird ways. But you can usually change them in a way without, like, it's not disruptive to change those files out. But at some point you look up and so, like, I just want a view of this service and the infrastructure behind the service, and I want to know how quickly I can make changes to that service, and how fast those changes propagate and how much human mediation is involved in that propagation. And beginning to do that, on the one hand, it's technologically very, very similar to Puppet, and it relies on the same people that are using Puppet today and are having success with it. But on the other hand, the business attachment to that is pretty different, right? Because you begin to give visibility from the technology all the way up to, strategic leadership who are saying, oh, well, my technology transformation needs to look like this or that. I want to connect that all together, not in a cynical way, not in a, my CIO is committing code and pushing it to production, but in a my CIO has priorities and I can map those priorities down to the, essentially what percent automated I have. So that's a very long-winded answer of not very much, but hopefully it suffices.
Yeah, well, it's definitely worth underlying all that. I would add my 2 cents. Try to make Puppet Puppet knowledge more spread, more because currently I see it everywhere. People use Ansible because Ansible is simple, so to say. And that simple is very relative, and especially now where Puppet started somehow hard in terms of you have a language to learn and to cope with, but now you have to cope with YAML files again. All the higher data at the end that you work with, and rarely you develop your own Puppet code, or at least in an organization. In a mature Puppet environment, you don't write Puppet code; you write higher data. And make people be more comfortable with using the tool, knowing the tool, make it easier to use in some way, I think could be one of the ways to make it more used in some way, and an appealing competition tool.
And I think that goes back to smaller tools, each with less surface area. It becomes easier to convince distributions to include them. It becomes easier to convince people, hey, you don't have to adopt the entire stack. You can adopt just this piece of the stack. And then the next piece of the stack is less expensive to adopt because you've already got, there's an 8-piece, the architecture is 8 pieces. You're already using 3 of them. Adding a 4th is not a big leap. And before you know it, you're using the whole stack. And I think that kind of component parts, again, this is from a architecture perspective, this is the thing I did least well. I needed to be more comfortable, and it was all just efficiency on my part. I didn't have enough time, and I was trying some combination of I didn't have the time to do all that correctly, and also I was pretty focused on
so many things to do.
Right. And I was just pretty focused on building a business. Right. I've got to get my business working to a certain extent, and will it hurt me to break the certificate authority out? Will it hurt me to break factor out and treat it give it its own organization or something? Probably won't hurt me, but it has cost, and and maybe it'll distract me and stuff like that. So, but as you mature, you kind of look up and go I really should have done this differently. So,
right. Well, questions about the future, if you want.
I can give you more made-up answers that have no value. Sure.
When you will be 100 years old, it will happen, I guess.
I can almost guarantee I'll be dead.
Well, let's say let's say you will be 100 years old. What kind of computer do you think you will be using at the time?
First, I'm slightly offended at the idea that I might only have one computer. Currently I have hundreds in my house of various varieties, and most of them we wouldn't call computers, right? I'm sitting in front of a computer that's classically a computer with the big screen and the keyboard and the mouse and the speakers and stuff like that. But I've got an iPad and I've got a laptop and I've got a phone and stuff like that. My stupid watch is a computer. So I mostly think the physical experiences we have with computers, I don't think they're going to change. I don't think they're going to wildly change. I think we might add some new ones. I do think more wearables. If you look at what success Apple has had with the Apple Watch and with the AirPods, I think you're going to see more of that. And some of it's going to be adding more things into those things because they're touching your body all the time, and you can learn a lot about yourself by having technology touching you all the time. And in a lot of ways, it doesn't feel very revolutionary, but it is completely different, right? Like 5 years ago or 10 years ago, when the Apple Watch came out, in general, there was not electronic stuff other than maybe your quartz watch or whatever touching your body all the time. And now it's like, oh, well, I can have a weather sensor for my own physical biome. Like, okay, well, that's different. I think we're going to see more and more of that. But I think we're always going to have a slab of glass in our pocket. I don't think we're going to switch to, I've got a Bluetooth headset that's always connected and it's speaking in my ear all the time. I do fear we're going to have a lot of people walking around with the equivalent of an Amazon Echo can on their bodies, recording everything that they see or hear. I hope that when I'm 100, we still see those people as weirdos and we shun them and we don't want to hang out with them, right? Like, but I guarantee you, there's going to be lots of people when the batteries get big enough and the processing gets cheap enough. There's going to be a lot of people with a necklace record. When you walk down the street, it's going to be recording you and it's going to be super creepy. But I think like the form factor we're using, I think these form factors are going to stick around. We're just going to add new form factors versus the desktop computer or the physical computer that's connected to a big monitor. I think those things are still going to be here because I still have my eyes all still work the same way. It'll always be faster to type with a keyboard than any other way, right? It'll always be like more instinctive to use physical keys than any other mechanism. But there's lots of room for additional things, and that's where I think we'll see interesting stuff.
Yeah, indeed. I would say, let me check if I have something interesting to ask you. Questions which I haven't asked you, which you would like to answer to, just to.
Yeah. The thing that I'm really interested in, well, there's lots of things, but when I look back on Puppet, I think I made a rational choice in building a business. I think I made a rational choice in making Puppet open source. And I think I made a rational choice in building a business around that open source. And I made a rational choice in raising money to support that business and to grow that business. But there were very different choices available, right? A lot of open source projects, for a long time, Apache was the internet, right? If you're running a website, you were either a Microsoft stoolie running IIS or you were running Apache. And yet Apache was never, like commercial enterprise realistically. In fact, if anything, Apache became an umbrella for a huge range of projects. And I think it was really successful. Now, do I think Apache is better off because there was no commercial enterprise behind it? It's unclear, right? I know MySQL, the commercial support behind MySQL has been a disaster over the last like 10, 15 years because now it's owned by, first it was owned by Sun and then by Oracle and blah, blah, blah. So I think there are some really interesting conversations to have about governance and open source versus commercial and what it means to both have an organization that's sponsoring and investing in a project and a community and a solution set, but also retain the community governance, also retain the community engagement. And this I think aligns well with, look, if we could take these pieces of Puppet and, today, if you view Puppet, it's kind of this like large, complex amoeba looking thing. If you say, like, let's take this piece and let's break that off and make it its own project, and Puppet still relies on it. The code doesn't really change. Maybe some names change or things like that. What opportunities exist for essentially not reconnecting to open source roots, because that doesn't really mean anything, but doing a better job of balancing the need. Like, it's expensive to build products, right? It's expensive to do a lot of these things. And more importantly, actually, I think a lot of people undervalue, it's like, oh, the reason why you have an open source company is because you need to hire a bunch of developers. Kind of. But realistically, if you don't have a bunch of sales and marketing people, then you're not going to tell your story very well. I actually think like projects need evangelization. They need people out in the field, on the ground, convincing people who would prefer not to ever change anything. They need the help to make those changes. And that help is, it's not in the form of engineering. It's not in the form of community engagement. It's in the form of sales and marketing. And I think those things are actually just as important to invest in for technology as engineering is, because a lot of people won't adopt new tech without those. So what I'm really interested in is, I don't want to say, oh, let's get to the point where we don't have any commercial enterprise, we don't have any of that stuff. But I do think there are interesting ways that I think the market does need to evolve. You know, in the old days, it was either one person doing it all by themselves, or it was, you know, the Apache Foundation, or it was a commercial company. And the new days, you look at like the Cloud Native Computing Foundation with its 10,000 applications, and it's just like, you can't look at that and go, that's the future we want to live in, right? There got to be other ways of thinking about how we maintain the value of open source. We maintain the value of connectable components that are part of an ecosystem, and we aren't the only ones who are participants in that ecosystem. But at the same time, we can actually afford to pay our developers, and we can afford to continue to evangelize. We can afford to run community events and things like that. I think there's some interesting work to be figured out there. And I don't think anybody has the right answer right now. And I especially think we're in a state where it doesn't look like anybody knows, right? You know, in 2010, everyone knew this is the way to do it. And in 2015, it was like, no. Now we have the right way to do it. And in 2020, it just feels like everyone went, crap, we have no idea what to do now, right? Like you had these tiny little events like Monorama and stuff that were really successful and really great, but there's like 200 people at them, right? Maybe 500 people at them. But no one wants to go to VMworld anymore. And like all the big company stuff has gone away. Like it's not compelling anymore, but there's not some new thing to replace, not the technology side, but like the connectivity, the human connectivity, the events where you go in and you're like, man, I have to go to this event every year because this is where I meet the 500 most important people, the most interesting people in the field that I work in, doing the work that I'm most interested in. We don't have that world anymore like we used to have. And the reason we don't have it is because the world that was there is kind of irrelevant now, but we haven't built some new thing to replace it, right? And I feel like events, for example, were such a huge part of how every community got built, how every company got built, how every technology became adopted. But the event world is messy right now, or it's not messy. It's not interesting, right? There's not a, you know, the Apple event ecosystem is kind of more interesting in a lot of ways to a lot of people. And it's like, well, those are horrific events from a community perspective, from a, you know, engagement perspective. They're marketing funnels. They're not or marketing megaphones. So like, where is my Lisa conference? Where is my OzCon? Where is my, you know, LinuxConf Australia? That, you know, and many of those, like, they still exist to some extent, but they don't have the same cultural impact that they had from, you know, 2005 to 2015. And, you know, and there was that period of time where like VMworld, you might be cynical about it, but VMworld was the biggest technical event in the world, and anybody in infrastructure, you had to go to it because everyone went to it. Like, where is that today? And how do you build a world that you have viable companies that are building businesses and are successful, and you have community members who are thrilled and excited, and you have open source technology that people can really build on and really rely on, and it's not going to be screwed up because Larry Ellison owns it suddenly. And then you have it connected on the ground in events that are both like centralized and gigantic, like VMworld San Francisco was, but are also spread all over the world. Like, I don't remember what VMware used to call their community events, but that was a huge part of not just VMware, but connecting the people and the technology that they're using. And I feel like there's some new thing that needs to happen. There's some new world that needs to be born, and it hasn't been born yet.
Well, if I can say, come back to FOSDEM in Europe, the biggest open source conference.
I would love to come back to FOSDEM. I would love to. I love FOSDEM. FOSDEM is, for one, is a thing that cannot exist in, like, there is only, I don't think you could do another one of those. You know, maybe Australia could have one or something like that. But also, there's a beautiful chaos to FOSDEM in terms of, like, not so much the organization itself, but in terms of what you might expect from there. Right. But because I don't think FOSDEM is replicatable. I don't think you could realistically say like, hey, let's do many FOSDEMs around the world, or let's do that. In some sense, FOSDEM has to be a unique experience. And so again, I love it. I would love to go back, but I don't think it's exactly the example we're going to use to figure out what the new world looks like. Partially because we've been doing FOSDEM long enough that if that was the template we were going to build the future on, I think we would know that by now. And pretty obviously, people aren't out there building more FOSDEMs.
Right. So, Luke, thank you very much. All very impressive insights from you. Always a good pleasure to hear. Last question. Name a person I should invite in one of the next editions of this podcast. Someone who is worth listening to, so to say, and talking with.
Yeah. Name a person you should invite. And you're specifically interested in operations and infrastructure.
Operations, IT, DevOps, the field.
Yeah. I have done a pretty good job of not being connected in that space. I'm going to have to get back to you on that one because honestly, like, for one, I'm really bad at names. My startup after Puppet was a startup built to help me essentially keep track of who I knew and what I was doing with them because I'm so bad at names and I'm so bad at not just names, but like nouns. I regularly forget really, really basic words. One of the things I've learned since I left Puppet is that I'm autistic, and it helps to explain a lot of what I've found challenging as the CEO of Puppet and what I found incredibly difficult as an executive managing a 500-person company was just, wow, the things that most people have, I do not have. And the things that I have, most people don't have. So it turns out that, I'm fundamentally bad at names and nouns and even like I'm an investor in like 15, 20 companies. I can name 2 of them maybe off the top of my head if I had to. And it's like, oh, well, I know this one because it's the one in London and they're doing, like I could tell you vague things, but I don't know the name of the CEO. I don't know the name of the company. I don't know where they're headquartered. Like, it's ridiculous. So
okay, so you are
my
not
kryptonite. I'm sorry. Yep,
but I have my own list. I will try to.
I will say, if you could get anybody involved, anybody from the Ink and Switch workshop, anybody in the Ink and Switch studio to talk about local first software. That's what I'm really, really interested in, and it's what I think infrastructure. I think local first software is as relevant to infrastructure as it is to my, text tools. Like Obsidian is my local first text management application, but I think it's just as important to infrastructure. Git being an example of something I can use connected, but I can use completely disconnected and on my own machine, and then synchronize when I feel like it. And I think a lot of tools today are being built with the assumption that you're connected to the internet, with the assumption that I can always talk to that central server. And I think we all know that's not true. And that if you build them instead with the assumption that, local matters first, and then, the synchronization engines that we talk to the central server can be smarter. And this is one of the things I did pretty well with Puppet. It works locally, but it also, connects to that central server. So I think finding somebody who can talk about that stuff, I think could be pretty interesting and pretty valuable. So Martin Klepperman, I think is his last name, in London, or, Anselm, the CEO of Garden Computing, is a company I just invested in. Their technology is Jazz, but this is all very user-facing stuff. It's not infrastructure in the sense of, DevOps or stuff. But I think your community should think about it and know about it, because I think it should affect the choices we make about the technology we adopt, both as users, but also as administrators and technology professionals.
Cool. So you talk quite well to be autistic, or supposed to be autistic.
No, I'm definitely autistic, but it turns out lots of autistic people are very, very good at talking, but we're just there are other things we struggle with. So okay,
well, never mind. Luke, thank you for everything. All the best for your future and the twins. I remember that when we met the first time, the twins were just born, and now they are
right 16 in college or in high school. They're about to test for getting their driver's permit, and yep.
So that's a bad sign of times which keeps on passing for us and for everybody. I guess.
That's how it goes. All the alternatives are worse.
Right. Thank you again, Luke.
All right. Thank you.
DevOps Iterations.